So, I want to start a series about writing. Not about how to write exactly, but about how to think about writing. Because I think the biggest gap that most people have when they approach writing isn't talent or even skill. It's that they don't have a framework for understanding why stories work when they work and why they fall apart when they don't. And I want to start with something that sounds really academic, but really isn't, which is dialectics. Now, if you've heard the word dialectics before, it was probably in a philosophy class or from somebody on the internet who was trying to sound really smart. And that's actually kind of a shame because the actual concept is remarkably simple and it's one of the most useful tools you can have as a storyteller, even if you've never heard the word before in your life. So, what is it? At its most basic, dialectics is the idea that things develop through contradiction. So, you have a thing, and that thing contains within itself something that opposes it. And through the collision of those two forces, something new emerges. Now, the traditional terms for this are thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which, to be clear, is a major simplification. But you're not here for a philosophy class, so it's useful for our purposes today. Now, you will start with a position, and that position generates or it encounters its opposite. And from the conflict between them, a third thing is then produced that is different from either of the original two. Now, I do want to be clear. This is not just there are two sides to everything, okay? That's a common misunderstanding. Dialectics is not about balance. It's not about seeing both perspectives and meeting in the middle. The synthesis is not a compromise, it's a transformation. So that means that the two opposing forces don't just shake hands and split the difference. They collide. And what comes out of that collision is something that couldn't have existed without both of them. But it isn't reducible to either one alone. All right? So let me give you a very simple nonfiction example so you can actually see what I mean before we get anywhere near storytelling. So think about the concept of security and the concept of freedom. All right? These are, in many ways, opposed to each other. The more security you have, the more restrictions are in place, and the less freedom you will experience. The more freedom you have, the fewer protections exist, and the less secure you are. All right, these two ideas are in tension with each other. Now, a lot of people hear this and they think dialectics means meeting in the middle, okay? Finding a balance, a little security, a little freedom, everybody's happy. But that's not what's happening. A compromise between security and freedom would just be less of both, okay? You'd get some restrictions and some liberties and nobody would be satisfied because you haven't actually resolved the tension between them. You've just turned the volume down on it. So what actually happens when these two forces collide over time is that entirely new structures emerge that didn't exist in either concept all on its own. Okay? Take something like a constitution. A constitution is not a compromise between security and freedom. Okay? Pure security doesn't contain the concept of codified individual rights. Pure freedom doesn't contain the concept of binding legal limitations. A constitution is a new kind of thing. It's a framework that defines what the state can and cannot do, and that creates categories like due process and protected speech that neither security nor freedom would produce in isolation. It isn't less of both of them. It's something that neither one could have generated alone. And here's the key. The new thing, the constitutional framework, that immediately produces its own contradictions. All right? The right to free speech collides with the need for public safety. The right to privacy collides with the demands of law enforcement. These aren't failures of the system. They're the system generating its next set of opposing forces. The synthesis becomes a new thesis, which, produces its own antithesis, and the process continues. Now, as I said, this all sounds very academic, and it does when you lay it out like that. But here's the thing I want you to keep in mind. You already understand all of this intuitively, because every good story that you've ever experienced operates on this principle, whether the author knew the word dialectics or not. And that is what I want to get into. Not dialectics as philosophy, but dialectics as the underlying engine of narrative. Because once you can see it, you can see why certain stories work and why certain stories don't, and more importantly, you can see exactly where a story broke down and you can diagnose why. But before I get into really specific examples, I do want to make sure that the concept itself is clear, because everything that I'm going to talk about going forward is going to build on top of this foundation. Okay? So when I say that things develop through contradiction, what I mean is that a story is not a sequence of events. All right? Events are what happens. Story is what those events mean when they push against each other. Okay? If a character wants something and they get it without opposition, you don't have a story. You have a list of things that happened. The story begins the moment something resists. And what makes it a good story is when that resistance isn't external decoration, but something that comes from within the very thing that the character wants. Right? So a man who wants power and then gets it isn't a story. A man who wants power, gets it, and discovers that the power itself undermines the thing he wanted the power for, that's dialectics in action. The thesis, his desire for power, contains within itself the antithesis, which is the destruction of what he values. And what emerges from that contradiction is the actual story. This is going to be the framework for everything that I talk about going forward. So when I look at, say, characters, at plot structures, at world building, at dialogue, I'm going to be looking at where the contradictions are, whether the writer understood them, and what happened when they did or didn't. So let's start with characters, because this is actually where most people are first going to encounter dialectics in fiction, even if they don't realize it. Now, the simplest version of a dialectic character is one where what the character wants and what they have to do in order to get that want are fundamentally in conflict. And I don't mean that it's hard. I don't mean that there are obstacles. I mean that the very act of pursuing what they want transforms them into something that contradicts the person that they were when they started wanting it. Okay, so I think one of the clearest examples of this, one that most people already know, is going to be Anakin Skywalker. Okay, so in The Phantom Menace, Anakin wants a better life, right? He's a slave on Tatooine. He has absolutely nothing, and the opportunity comes along for him to become a Jedi, which is about as far removed from slavery as you can possibly get. Freedom, purpose, power, respect. That offers everything that he doesn't have. But in order to get that life, he has to leave behind the only person who matters to him, his mother. You know, the one stable, loving relationship in his entire existence. She's the reason he's survived being a slave. She's the emotional foundation of who he is. And so the price of his freedom is abandoning her. Now, a lot of people are going to look at this and they're going to say, well, that's just a trade-off. He gives up one thing to get another. And if that's all it was, it wouldn't be dialectical. That's true. It would just be a difficult choice. Okay? People make difficult choices all the time in stories. That is not interesting on its own. What makes this dialectical is that the choice doesn't resolve. It transforms. So Anakin leaves. He does become a Jedi. But the loss of his mother doesn't go away. It sits inside of him. It festers. It becomes the thing that defines his relationship with the Jedi Order itself. Because the Jedi tell him that attachment is dangerous, that he needs to let go. And he can't, because the letting go was the thing that cost him the most in the first place. The Jedi are asking him to do the thing that already hurt him. and also to be at peace with it, and he simply can't. So, the thesis, Anakin wants freedom and he wants a better life. That collides with the antithesis. The cost of that life is losing the person that he loves the most. And what emerges from this conflict is not resolution. What emerges is a new Anakin, one who has freedom, but is haunted by what it cost. One who is inside of the Jedi Order, but is fundamentally at odds with its core philosophy. That's the synthesis. And that synthesis immediately becomes a new thesis with its own contradictions. Because by the time that we get to Revenge of the Sith, 2 movies later, the same engine is running, but the stakes have changed entirely. So Anakin loves Padme. He's terrified that she's going to die. He's already lost his mother, and he knows exactly what that feels like, and he will do anything to prevent it from happening again. But the tools he needs to save her don't exist within the Jedi framework. The Jedi would tell him to accept his loss, to let it go. The same thing that they've always been telling him. The thing that he has never been able to do on his own. And so the only path to saving the person he loves runs directly through the destruction of everything else that he's built. So to save Padme, he has to turn to the dark side. To protect love, he has to become something that is incapable of it. And again, you might look at this and you might say, well, it's a trade-off. He chose the dark side to save her. But that's not what happens. He doesn't make a clean exchange. The act of turning to the dark side to save her is the thing that destroys her. Okay? His desire to protect her is the engine of her destruction. The thesis and antithesis don't just coexist. They are the same impulse, viewed from different angles, and the synthesis is Darth Vader, a person who lost everything precisely because he could not accept losing anything. Now, before you write a bunch of comments, I will be upfront. The execution of this in the actual film is very clumsy. Okay? Padme dies of what the movie essentially calls losing the will to live, which is about as unsatisfying as it sounds. And it's one of the most criticized parts of the entire prequel trilogy for a very good reason. But the underlying structure is sound, even when the writing on the screen isn't sound. Okay, the idea that Anakin's turn to the dark side is the thing that kills the person he turned to the dark side to save is a genuinely strong dialectical structure. The movie just doesn't stick the landing on how it gets there, and that is actually a useful distinction for us, because it does show that understanding the structure and executing on it are 2 different skills. You can have a perfect dialectical bone structure underneath a story, and you can still fumble the actual scene work. All right? Structure is going to tell you where the power is. You're still going to have to write it well. But even with that caveat, the structure itself is what I want you to be focusing on, because the contradiction here isn't external. Okay? Nobody is forcing Anakin into these positions from the outside. The Jedi aren't making him fall in love. Palpatine isn't creating his fear of loss. He's exploiting a fear that was already there. The contradiction itself is baked into what Anakin wants. His love is the source of his destruction. His desire for freedom is the thing that traps him. And each time the contradiction produces something new, that new thing carries its own contradictions forward. Okay? This is very different from a character who just has a flaw. All right? A lot of writers will tell you that characters need flaws. And that's true as far as it goes, but a flaw on its own is static. A character who is arrogant is just arrogant until the plot punishes them for it. That's not dialectical. That's just cause and effect. A dialectical character is one where the flaw and the virtue are the same thing, where the thing that makes them capable is also the thing that makes them dangerous, where their greatest strength, examined from another angle, is going to be their greatest weakness, and not because the writer decided to balance the scales, but because that's how the trait actually works when you follow it to its conclusion, right? So Anakin's loyalty is his flaw. His capacity for love is his capacity for destruction. These aren't two separate traits that happen to coexist inside of one person. They are the same trait, and the story is about what happens when that trait meets a world that can't accommodate it. And this is the thing that I want you to take away from this, because it applies to every character you will ever write or ever analyze. If a character's strength and weakness aren't connected, if you can remove the flaw without changing the virtue, the character isn't dialectical. They're just a person with a list of traits. And a person with a list of traits is not a person. It's a character sheet. So that's characters. But dialectics doesn't just operate on the level of individual people. It operates on the level of systems, governments, institutions, entire civilizations. And this is where it becomes incredibly useful for the purposes of world building, because most world building falls apart precisely because the writer doesn't understand how political systems actually change. So for the purposes of this, let's stick with Star Wars, because the prequel trilogy is one of the clearest examples of dialectical world building in popular fiction, even if most people don't think of it that way. So in Episode 1, what is the status quo? The Galactic Republic. It's enormous. It spans most of the galaxy. It has a Senate, it has representatives, it has procedures, and it also has no teeth. So the Republic doesn't have a unified ideology. It doesn't have a standing army. Its entire method of governance is negotiation. When something goes wrong, they send diplomats. And when the diplomats fail, they send more diplomats. The system is built on the assumption that everyone will eventually come to the table, because coming to the table is what you do. So that's your thesis. A sprawling, democratic body that functions through consensus and negotiation. And it's held together not by force, but by the shared agreement that this is how things are done. Now, enter the Trade Federation. Okay? They've decided to blockade the planet of Naboo. Now, they're not negotiating. They're not sending representatives. They've just parked warships in orbit, and they've told an entire planet that they don't get to eat until the Trade Federation gets what it wants. This is a direct challenge to the Republic's foundational assumption that disputes are going to be resolved through dialogue. The Trade Federation, on the other hand, is saying no, disputes are resolved through power. Whoever has the ships, they make the rules. So that's your antithesis. Not just an opposing faction, but an opposing principle. Okay? The Republic says we talk. The Trade Federation says we don't have to talk. So what's going to be the synthesis? War. Now, neither side backs down. The Republic can't negotiate its way out of a blockade, and the Trade Federation isn't interested in compromising. The collision between these two approaches produces armed conflict, which is something that neither side's original framework was designed for. Because the Republic didn't have an army, and the Trade Federation expected to deal with diplomats and maybe a Jedi or maybe two, not an actual ground war on Naboo led by the planet's own queen uniting with the Gungans against an outside threat. And yet, here we are, with a battle on Naboo that shouldn't have happened according to either side's understanding of how the galaxy works. But here is where it gets interesting, because that synthesis doesn't resolve anything. It becomes a new thesis. So the Republic has now been confronted with the reality that negotiation alone doesn't work. Okay, they did win on Naboo, barely, with a combination of luck and a 14-year-old queen who decided to take matters into her own hands. But the structural problem hasn't gone away. The Republic still has no army, and the Trade Federation still has money, resources, and now a droid army that they can just rebuild. The crisis was solved locally, but the contradiction that produced it is still sitting right there at the galactic level. So now, the thesis is a republic that knows it needs to be able to fight, but doesn't have the means to do so. The antithesis is an opposing force that has already demonstrated that it will use military power to get what it wants, and is only going to get more brazen about it. And so the synthesis is the clone army, a military force that didn't exist before, that could not exist before because the Republic's entire identity was built around not needing such a force. The very thing the Republic defined itself against, which is centralized military power, is now the thing that it requires in order to survive. And so now there's a galaxy-wide war, which, again, is not a resolution. It's a new thesis generating new contradictions. But earlier, I said that there were two threads here, and I do want to come back to the other one now, because it's the more important one for understanding how dialectics works in a political world-building context. So remember what I said about the Republic's lack of unity? No centralized ideology, no unified purpose, just a loose coalition of systems that all agreed to talk to each other to avoid warfare. That's the thesis. The antithesis is the crisis itself. Not just the Trade Federation, but everything that follows. The Clone Wars, the Separatist movement, the constant state of emergency. All of it is pressing against the Republic's fundamental nature, demanding something that the Republic was specifically designed not to provide, which is centralized authority. And then the synthesis of this is the Empire. Not because somebody conquered the Republic from the outside, because the Republic's own contradictions produced it. The Republic couldn't function in a state of perpetual crisis without centralizing power. The Senate voted for it. They gave Palpatine those emergency powers because the system demanded that they do so. The democracy didn't fall because a tyrant seized control. The democracy is what produced the tyrant because the contradiction between its decentralized nature and the need for decisive action during wartime could only be resolved by abandoning the decentralization part. This is what makes the prequels genuinely interesting as political world building, regardless of what you think of them as movies. The Empire is not an external force that destroys the Republic. The Empire is what the Republic becomes when its internal contradictions reach a point where the original structure can no longer hold. The thesis contained the seeds of its own antithesis, and the synthesis is a fundamentally different system that could not have existed without both of those things. And this is the thing that I want writers to understand about political world building. Systems don't change because bad guys show up. Right? Systems change because the system itself produces the conditions that make change inevitable. So if your fictional government collapses because a villain knocked it over, that's not a story about political change. That's a story about a villain. If your fictional government collapses because its own foundational principles couldn't survive contact with reality, now you have something that feels real, because that's how it actually works in the real world. Every political system contains within itself the contradiction that will eventually transform it. A democracy that can't act decisively in a crisis will centralize. An empire that centralizes too much will fracture. A revolution that overthrows tyranny will, without structure, become tyrannical itself. These are not plot twists. Okay, they're dialectics. And if you understand them, your world building stops being a map with borders on it, and it starts being a living system that's going to change for reasons that make sense to everyone. So now we've covered setting, and we've covered characters. So let's now talk about theme, and specifically, let's talk about conflict in regards to themes, because conflict is where most writing advice starts, and it's also where most writing advice stops too early. All right, so you have definitely heard the categories, right? Man versus nature, man versus man, man versus society, man versus self, man versus God. Whatever framework you were taught in school, the idea is the same. A character is in opposition to something, and the story is then going to be about that opposition. And that is true, but it is incomplete. Because if all you do is pit a character against something, and then you resolve it, you don't have a theme. You have a situation. Okay? Like, a man gets stuck on the mountain. He struggles. He gets off the mountain. If he's the same person at the bottom that he was at the top, you don't have a man versus nature story. You have an anecdote. A thing happened, and then it was over. The mountain was an inconvenience. It wasn't a force. But if a man gets stuck on a mountain, and in the process of surviving, he is changed by it, if the collision between who he was and what the mountain demanded of him produces someone different, now you have a story, because the two forces met and neither one came out the same. That's the dialectic of theme. The conflict isn't just opposition. The conflict is transformative. The thesis is the character as they are. The antithesis is the force that's acting against them. And the synthesis is not victory or defeat. The synthesis is what the character becomes as a result of the collision. Okay? Something that is neither who they were before, nor a complete surrender to what opposed them. They are something new. And this is the part that most writing advice skips entirely in my experience, because they will tell you that you need conflict, and they will tell you that your character needs to face obstacles. But they won't tell you that the obstacle has to change the character in a way that the character could not have changed on their own. Okay? They won't tell you that the opposition has to produce something, not just test something. Because there is a version of man versus nature that is not dialectical. A character goes into the wilderness, they face danger, they use their skills, and then they come home. They were competent before, and they are competent after. The wilderness confirmed what we already knew about them. That's not transformation, that's a skills demonstration. Now, compare that to something where the wilderness strips away everything the character thought they knew about themselves, where surviving means becoming something that they wouldn't have recognized before, where the person who walks out of the forest is not the person who walked into the forest. And that change is permanent, and it's complicated, and it's not entirely positive. Okay? The difference is that in the first version, the character and the opposing force just bounce off each other. In the second version, they collide, and that collision produces something that did not exist before. And this applies to every kind of conflict, not just survival stories. Man versus man, for example. Two characters oppose each other. If one wins and one loses and neither is changed, you've written a competition, not a conflict. If the act of fighting each other forces both of them to become something that they weren't before the fight started, now the conflict has produced a synthesis. Now you have a theme, because the story is about what happens when these two forces meet, not about which one is stronger. Or take man versus society. A character pushes against the system that they live in. If they win and the system changes, or if they lose and the system stays the same, that's just outcome. But if the act of pushing against the system changes the character in ways that they did not expect, if fighting the system makes them more like the system, or if the system absorbs their resistance and becomes something different as a result, now you have dialectics. Now the theme isn't just one person against the world. The theme is what resistance actually does to both the individual and the thing being resisted. Or let's go with man versus self. This one is almost inherently dialectical if it is done right, because the two opposing forces are inside of the same person. So the character wants two contradictory things, or maybe they are two contradictory things, and the story is about what emerges from that internal collision. But even here, writers mess it up, and they do so by resolving the contradiction too cleanly. The character overcomes their flaw. They accept who they really are. The internal conflict ends with one side winning and the other just disappearing. That's not synthesis. That's just picking a winner. So a dialectical version of man versus self is one where the character does not resolve the contradiction so much as they are transformed by it. They don't pick one side of themselves over the other. They become a third thing, someone who contains both the original impulse and the thing that opposed it, and who has to live with what that means going forward. That's what theme actually is. It's not a message. It's not a moral. It's the question that the dialectic poses. So when this force meets this other force, what is produced? The story doesn't have to answer that question neatly. In fact, the best stories often don't. The best stories will let the synthesis sit there, complicated and unresolved, and it will trust the audience to sit with it. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that a clean moral is automatically bad. Fables have clean morals. Parables have clean morals. There are plenty of forms of storytelling where the moral is the point, and that's fine. But those forms are short, they're contained, and they're structured around delivering that moral from the start. They aren't pretending to be dialectical. The problem is when a story sets up a genuine collision between two forces and gives both of them weight and lets the audience feel the tension between them, and then resolves it by just picking one side and pretending the other didn't have a point. That's not resolution. That's the writer putting their thumb on the scale. And the longer and the more complex the story is, the worse this feels. Because the audience has spent time with both sides of the contradiction, and they can tell when one of them gets quietly smothered so that the ending can feel clean. A fable can get away with this. It can get away with a clean moral, because it never pretended that the other side had any weight to it. A novel, on the other hand, that spends, say, 300 pages building a real dialectic and then collapses it into a fortune cookie isn't telling a story anymore. It's making an argument and pretending that it wasn't one. So before I wrap all of this up now, I do want to cover just a few things quickly because I can already hear some of the responses to what I've said. So first, dialectic thinking is not a cheat code. It is not a formula that you can plug your story into and get a good narrative out the other end. Okay? It's a way of understanding how narratives function. It's a lens. It helps you to look at a story and identify where the forces are, where the collisions are, and where the transformations are or aren't happening. It helps you to diagnose problems. It can help you understand why something you wrote feels very flat, or why something somebody else wrote feels very alive. But it is not a recipe. You still have to actually write the thing. You still have to make the characters feel real, and the dialogue land, and the pacing work. Dialectics tell you where the engine is. You still have to build the car itself. Second, can you tell a story that isn't dialectical? Yes. You absolutely can. But it is harder than you think it is, because you do run the risk of writing a story where nothing really happens. And I don't mean like nothing in the sense of no events are occurring. I mean nothing in the sense of no transformation. Events happen. Characters do things. Situations resolve. And at the end, nobody and nothing is meaningfully different from where they started. It can be done well. If you look at, say, individual Sherlock Holmes mysteries, most of them aren't dialectical. A mystery is going to be presented, and Holmes is going to solve it, and the world is more or less the same afterward. Holmes isn't changed. Watson isn't changed. The resolution confirms what we already knew about them rather than producing something new. They function as self-contained puzzles, and Arthur Conan Doyle understood that's what they were, and he structured them accordingly. Now, you could argue that across the entire body of work, the Holmes-Watson dynamic has dialectical elements to it, that their relationship develops and produces something over time, and certain individual stories do reveal things about the world that do shift how we understand it. That's entirely fair as analysis, but the structure of most of the individual Holmes mysteries, the thing that you're going to sit down and read in one go, is not built on transformation. It's built on revelation. The answer was always there. Holmes finds it, and then we all go home. That's a different engine, and it does work, but it's a much harder thing to sustain than most people realize, because the moment that your audience expects transformation and then doesn't get it, the story feels like nothing happened. Third, and this one comes up a lot, people will say that their world building sounds like an RPG. Now, what does that mean exactly? That is a bigger discussion, and it's probably something that needs its own video, but the short answer is this. It probably means that you've created events and not consequences. You have things that happened in your world, but those things don't push against each other and they don't produce change. Your history ends up reading like a timeline rather than like a series of collisions happening. But like I said, that's a different topic entirely, and it needs its own video for me to really go into it. Like and subscribe and comment if you'd like me to do that, actually. But fourth and finally, this is for anyone who has been listening to all of this and is now staring at their own work, feeling like they need to map out the thesis and antithesis of every single element in their story. Stop. Take a breath. Back up. Okay? If you're feeling overwhelmed, chances are that you're thinking way too granularly. You do not need to actually identify the dialectical structure of every single character, every single faction, every single subplot, every background detail. You don't. You need to identify which forces are actually important, okay? Which ones are actually acting on the narrative. So, let me use another example from Star Wars. In the Star Wars prequels, you do not need to know the thesis and antithesis of every single member of the Republic Senate. Could you come up with that for all of them? Probably. Should you? No, absolutely not. Because most of them do not matter. Okay, they're scenery. The forces that matter are the big ones that act upon the narrative. The Republic's inability to act decisively, Palpatine's exploitation of that weakness, Anakin's fear of loss. Those are the forces that are driving the story. Everything else is set dressing. So if you're sitting there trying to dialectically map your entire world from the ground up and you're drowning in it, take a step back, take a breath, ask yourself, which parts of this are truly important? Which parts are actually pushing against each other and producing change? Focus on those. Let all the other stuff, just let it rest. Let it be what it is. Okay? Because the goal here isn't to turn writing into an academic exercise, as much as it sounds like it is. The goal is to give you a way of seeing the machinery that's underneath the stories that you love, so that when you sit down to tell your own stories, you know where the engine is and you know how to make it run.